Reverend Paul would have been on your reading list. I luckily met her here last year in York. Despite being such a prominent historian, she happily waited for me to finish my shift at work so we could talk about my research. It is these kind of conversations which we want to replicate today, to encourage undergraduate students to feel like not intimidated, that they understand that the others have a voice which the historians want to hear. It is my honour to welcome Catherine as our keynote speaker today.
Thank you. These chairs are a bit dangerous. You're likely to go for a ride in them without meaning to. Thank you very much, and thank you to Claire and Olivia for the invitation to be here today, and congratulations on what you've done. It's really impressive. I think it's incredibly well organised and representative of so many different issues. And I think one of the things that I think has been really good about this morning, and as we go into the afternoon, is that you've really organised it to leave time for plenty of people to talk, so that I've been to so many conferences where there's no time to talk, and it's very, very frustrating. So, well done altogether. Well, it's very interesting to hear what's going on today and to have a chance to listen to those of you who are making presentations and engaging in the debates. And it's very encouraging to see the variety of kinds of work that's being presented on people of colour in varied contexts, on black activism, on racism, on indigeneity, on women, feminism, queer history, trans histories, disability, embodiment, autobiographical reflections coming up this afternoon, questions of terminology, a really fantastic range of issues that we're discussing, which help us to think about what it means to talk about marginal histories and why it matters. I imagine the idea of the conference was very much associated with the response to the Royal Historical Society report on black and minority ethnic representation in the historical profession, which, as we all know, is a disgraceful story opened up by that report. And it's very good to have Jonathan here today, who worked on that report, so that it's something that we could talk about more if that was helpful. But what you've done today is open out marginality into a whole lot of areas beyond race and ethnicity. Well, I want to make 3 brief points. Actually, I better look at my watch. Drawing on my own work and my experience as a historian over rather a long time. I did my undergraduate degree in the 1960s. Well, my first point is that history is always about debate and contestation. That's what history is. History is telling different stories, using different theoretical frameworks, using different materials to tell different stories. And it will always be contested, which is a very good thing. It would be terrible if there was only one story. Now, we know that there are histories which are more dominant than others, and that part of what we're doing by insisting on new work around questions of marginality is undermining, indeed, those establishment histories, those dominant histories, those what Foucault would call regimes of truth, which become established and which we've seen really so dramatically at work in these last 2 years, 3 years, whatever it is, over Brexit. You know, the story of who Britons are and what they want, and the need to challenge that story and look at the variety of ways, variety of peoples, the variety of ways of thinking about what kind of society we want to live in that is not only one story. I've heard a couple of people this morning talking about what's taught in their departments and the absence of particular kinds of subjects. And that reminded me of the first university occupation I was involved in, which was in 1968, which was all part of the university, the student uprisings of 68. I know that most of you here were not even a gleam in your mother's eyes at that point, but some of us have been around for a long time. And it's just interesting to remember that the student uprising in Birmingham, which is where I was in the history department in 1968, actually started around discussions of what was wrong with the history syllabus and dissatisfaction with how history was being taught. And we started having little discussions in the department, in the little seminar room there was, why is it that we never talk about what frameworks are being used in this history teaching? There was no historiography. Needless to say, there were no women, there was no gender, there was no race. I mean, don't even begin to think about those issues. But there was no historiography. So in other words, history was being taught as if it was straightforward what it was, that you looked at the documents and you understood from the documents what the truth of the matter was. So I like remembering that the occupation in Birmingham, which then took place, one of the starting points was what was wrong with the history syllabus. And of course there were many other students saying what was wrong with their syllabuses. And that led to change. And that just reminds me to remind you that if there are issues that are not being taught in your departments that you think that you think are important, say so. Ask for them. Say how it's important that now disability should be taught. Why are there so few historians of disability? Where is that work going to come from? And in a way, that's the kind of subject that is being stirred up by the Royal Historical Society report, and of course that comes from a whole much work over decades in relation to Black British history, Black representation and so on in the society. It's like something that's come out of a lot of activity of various kinds. So do remember that when you're thinking about history, there are always histories, there's always contestation, and when you read a history book, it's not the truth, it's somebody's representation of a particular way of thinking about the world. And that notion of an authoritative account, which of course is what a lot of historians want to make you think. It's written in such a way that this obviously is true. Obviously, because, I know, and I've worked now on two major historians. One was Macaulay, who of course was the great Whig historian of the 19th century, and whose version of history was so powerful, and actually remains so powerful, because Churchill was deeply influenced by it, and of course, as we all know, Boris Johnson regards himself as the heir of Churchill, so that story of England is, there are continuities right through that history. So for me, unpicking how it was that Macaulay produced the Whig story of England that he produced, how it was that he came to totally marginalise questions of empire, how it was that women had such a particular role in his history, how did that relate to his own family situation, his own psychic needs, his own relationships with women. These were ways of unpicking the authority of the text and demonstrating that he was a man writing. I mean, he spent 20 years writing it, he put a lot of work into it, he was a great writer, but it doesn't mean it was all true. So similarly now, I'm working on the authoritative historian of Jamaica in the 18th century, Edward Long, and trying to do the same kind of work of unpicking his narrative and understanding making sense of what it is that he's doing with his history writing. You're going to get in the next few weeks two very different stories of the women's movement. This weekend is the 50th anniversary of the first Women's Liberation Conference, which took place in Oxford 50 years ago, at what was then Ruskin College. It's being celebrated this weekend in what is unfortunately no longer Ruskin College, but was bought by a much wealthier college, Exeter College. So Ruskin has become Exeter. Ruskin was a trade union college. It's now a regular Oxford College. Anyway, it's taking place there, and no doubt there'll be many stories there of what to make of both that original conference and of the history of women's liberation and feminism since then. But I'm not sure if it's next week or the week after, Misbehaving is opening, the film which is the story of the famous moment when young feminists went into Miss World and threw flower bags and so on and disrupted Miss World. And that was one of the most sort of celebrated dramas at the beginning of the second wave of feminism. So that film, which is, will give you a very different story of the women's movement and of that event from the one that you will get in if you were to be in Oxford this weekend. So it's just reminding you the varieties of history and the contestation over history. So that's my first point. History is always about debate and contestation. My second point is about margins and the ways in which what begin as margins can de-center the centre. So what start as margins can unpick and undermine the ways in which the centre has been constituted. And I think that's a very important point. It doesn't always happen, but it can happen. So the relation between margins and centre is never a straightforward one. I mean, in what sense? What constitutes the centre? It would be very interesting to hear actually what you think constitutes the centre of the historical discipline now. Very tricky question, actually. Isn't it much more that there are a lot of different centres? I mean, it's not like the 19th century when the Whig orthodoxy absolutely dominated. When I was a student, by far the most influential school for anybody who thought of themselves as in any way a critical historian was Marxist history. That's certainly not the centre of anything anymore. So what is it that constitutes the centre now that you're thinking, you're all writing about the margins in relation to that centre? So when women's history and feminist history first emerged in the 1960s, and of course at that time we thought we were totally innovative. We thought nobody had ever thought these things before. And I can remember so clearly actually women of an older generation looking askance at us as if, do you really think you're the first people to say these things? And of course we did. We were absolutely convinced we were the first people. And it took years to discover. I mean, it was an absolute eye-opener to me when I discovered the range of women historians in the 19th century. There were loads of them, absolutely loads of them. And making a living from writing kinds of books that were seen as suitable for women to write. So women were excluded, for the most part, from writing national history, but they were writing biographies, they were writing domestic histories, they were writing about kings and queens. They were extremely popular. So this idea that, the first emergence of women's history is in the 1960s and 70s, nonsense. But of course, each time, the way in which the history is done changes. So it doesn't just stay the same. The ways in which women were confined into writing certain kinds of areas, about certain kinds of areas in history, though of course they could write in fiction about other areas. I mean, can you think of anybody that's written a better history than George Eliot's Middlemarch. I mean, it's just the best history there is of the mid-19th century provincial life. You know, there isn't a history book that can compare with it. So we have to think about different kinds of writing as well and what they open up to us. So I wanted to say about that, you know, it's still the case, nevertheless, that although now, you know, in the 1960s, 1970s, there were a handful of books on women and feminist history. You know, now you go into the bookshops or you look on Amazon or wherever you look, there are hundreds and hundreds, but still hardly any in comparison with military history. So is military history the centre and women's, gender, feminist history a margin? I mean, how do we constitute these boundaries? Where do we think the real influences are? And how does change occur? And I would say, regretfully, that feminist history and gender history has still not been mainstreamed after all this time. To my rage last week, or the week before, I read a new global history of the bourgeoisie. You know, loads of chapters about all the different bourgeoisies everywhere. Now you would think from reading this book that the bourgeoisie was, guess who? Men. So actually, half of them were women. And the only ways in which women appear in this book is in terms of dress, in terms of home life. I mean, the notion that women were as engaged in making a class, in making the bourgeoisie as men were, I mean, it's simply not entered the thinking of these people. The notion that family was at the heart of bourgeois society, that family was the most important structure in bourgeois society, and that how family organised in that period is absolutely critical to understanding the organisation of the whole society. Family, not there. Very striking how completely demarcated these histories are, and how we need to absolutely struggle to put them together, to insist on gender as relational, to insist on gender as classed and classed, class as gendered, and so on. My third point is that it's the question about how visibility happens. How is it that areas come into our thinking that haven't been there before? And here I would say, here I would absolutely draw on my own experience to say that the two main areas in which I've worked, which are in gender history and in colonial history from a post-colonial perspective, that each of those has absolutely come out of the society in which I live, what the political issues of the day are, how to think about what's going on around me. That, you know, the preoccupations of historians, for the most part, whether they're working on antiquity or working on the contemporary, come from the world in which we live. We are people in the world and using the frameworks of thinking and the ideas that are present to us. So with gender history, it was the women's movement that I've already been talking about, the history of race, colonialism, slavery, which I've been working on for the last 20 years now in different ways. It was what we often call Britain's post-colonial moment, the recognition that Britain had become a different kind of society in the 80s and 90s, and that issues of belonging and identity in this new world were very, very significant issues. So race emerged as another axis to think about, in the language we would now use, intersectionally. But there's something, somehow intersectional isn't a strong enough word. I don't know what the right word is, but you know, intersectional makes it sound as if it's, well, there's this section and there's this section, and there's this section, and then somehow they intersect. But actually, of course, we live the intersectionality in ourselves. We are. I mean, it doesn't sound quite right to think I'm intersectional. You know, it doesn't convey who the subject is in a properly embodied way. We don't as yet have the best language to do this work that needs doing. So race, we learn, structures and has structured British society over centuries in ways that was simply not apparent. It wasn't in the line of vision until people started thinking about race in the contemporary world. But once we started thinking about race in the contemporary world, just as we found with gender, when we went to the archives, there it was. You know, one of the most striking experiences I've had as a historian was that in the 70s and early 80s, I was working on archives in Birmingham and thinking about gender and class, thinking particularly about middle class families. And I never ever noticed any of the material about slavery, about race, about the presence of different marginal peoples in Birmingham. It wasn't the questions I was asking. So I literally did not see it. And then in the 90s, when I went back to look at the same documents, thinking about the same families, and I saw all this other material. I mean, it was literally about what my lens was, what my questions were, what was it I wanted to know that the archive was going to give me. Now, of course, the archive doesn't always give you what you want. There are real problems about that. And now there are some very, very imaginative ways of thinking about this. I mean, so for example, the difficulties of finding the voices of enslaved women in either the Caribbean, particularly the Caribbean, more so than in the US, because of course the history of the US South goes on later. There are more enslaved narratives and so on. It's very difficult in that period of in the British Caribbean. But people have been able to do miracles with, I just read a great article about 400 words that had been found in, you know, tucked into some estate records. And when you put those 400 words, which are apparently the words of an enslaved African woman who is remembering her capture, and she's remembering being transported across the Atlantic, and it stops when she arrives in Jamaica. But when you put together all the other ways there are of knowing about captivity, about the, as they were called, the slave factories, about the Middle Passage, you can do wonders with this fragment that's been found in the archive. So much depends on what it is you want to know. And that's always an absolutely important question. There's a great Haitian anthropologist and historian called Michel Rolfe Trujillo, who's written a wonderful book about Haiti and about the revolution in Haiti. And he argues there that in the late 18th century, it was literally beyond the imagination of white people, of colonists, or of the French to perceive what was really happening, because their conceptions of what it was to be living in a society that was a slave society never encompassed the idea of a successful slave revolution. So they couldn't think it, but nevertheless, in those archives, you find the evidence of it, which can then be reworked through new kinds of frameworks, and new histories can be written. So that's what we all need to do. Think about what the issues are, go to the archives, write new stories, Make them central, not marginal. Thank you.